Welcome to Week 3, Chapter 7 presentation. This is on risk management, controlling risk. The learning objectives for this presentation include to recognize strategy options, formulate a cost-benefit analysis, explain how to maintain risk controls, and describe popular strategies used in the industry to manage risk. Introduction to risk control. Controlling risk begins with an understanding of what risk mitigation strategies are and how to formulate them. An organization must choose one of 5 basic strategies to control risk: defense, transference, mitigation, acceptance, and termination. Defense is the preferred approach and is accomplished by means of countering threats, removing vulnerabilities, and limiting access to assets and adding protective safeguards. Transference may be accomplished by rethinking how services are offered, revising deployment models, outsourcing to other organizations, purchasing insurance, or implementing service contracts with providers. For service level agreements, in some circumstances, this is the only guarantee that an external organization will implement the level of security the client organization wants. Mitigation depends on the ability to detect and respond to an attack as quickly as possible. Here's a summary of mitigation plans. Note the plan, description, example, when it would be deployed, and what the time frame is. An organization that decides on acceptance as a strategy for every identified risk of loss may in fact be unable to conduct proactive security activities and may have an apathetic approach to security in general. Acceptance is recognized as a valid strategy, though, but only when the organization has determined the level of risk, assessed the probability, estimated the potential of damage, evaluated potential controls, performed a thorough risk assessment to include the cost-benefit analysis, which we will talk about, and determine that the cost to control the risk to a particular function, service, collection of data, or information asset do not justify the cost of implementing that controls. In either case, termination must be a conscious business decision. It's not simply the abandonment of an asset, which would technically qualify as acceptance. Managing risk. The reasoned approach to risk is one that balances the expense in terms of finance and usability of information assets against the possibility of loss if exploited. Residual risk is the amount of risk that remains after the organization has implemented policy, education and training, and technical controls and safeguards. Here's a figure showing you a material view of residual risk. The goal of information security is not to bring residual risk to zero, rather it's to bring it in line with an organization's risk appetite. Here are rules of thumb for selecting a strategy for managing risk. This flowchart shows risk handling action points. Note the threat source on top enters threat and vulnerability existence on the same point at which asset assessment goes through the checks for vulnerable, exploitable, and asset is vulnerable to attack. In risk management, at a minimum, each information asset threat pair that was developed in the risk assessment created previously should have a documented control strategy that clearly identifies any residual risk that remains after the proposed strategy has been executed. Here you see the risk control cycle. With feasibility and cost-benefit analysis, while the advantage of a specific strategy can be identified in a number of ways, the primary way is to determine the value of the information assets it is designed to protect. Cost-benefit analysis is also called an economic feasibility study. Just as it is difficult to determine the value of information, it is difficult to determine the cost of safeguarding it as well. Benefit is the value to an organization of using controls to prevent losses associated with a specific vulnerability, which is expressed as annualized loss expectancy, or ALE. The value of information differs, however, within and between organizations. When looking at asset valuation components, remember to include the ones shown here, from value retained from the cost of creating the information asset to the loss of revenue while the information assets are unavailable. Remember, once an organization has estimated the worth of various assets, it can begin to calculate the potential loss from the successful exploitation of vulnerability. Note the questions here that you should ask. SLE is the calculated value associated with the most likely loss from a single occurrence of a specific attack. This information is usually estimated. Remember, ARO, or annualized rate of occurrence, simply indicates how often you expect the attack to occur. Once you determine the loss of a single attack and the likely frequency of a successful attack, you can calculate the overall loss potential. In other words, the annualized loss expectancy would equal the SLE times the ARO, as we just defined. The cost-benefit analysis determines whether the benefit from a control alternative is worth the associated cost of implementing and maintaining the control. User acceptance and support can be achieved by means of communication, education, and involvement. Remember our SATA training last week? There are other methods of establishing feasibility. There is technical feasibility and political feasibility. Alternatives to feasibility analysis include benchmarking, best business practices, gold standards, and baselines. Recommended risk control practices. This preference has prompted an ongoing search for ways to design security architectures that go beyond the direct application of specific controls for specific information asset vulnerabilities. With qualitative and hybrid measures, note the more granular approach, the hybrid assessment, tries to improve upon the ambiguity of qualitative measures without resorting to the unsubstantiated estimation process that may arise when quantitative measures are used. The Delphi technique can be applied to the development of scales, asset validations, asset or threat rankings, and any scenario that can benefit from the input of more than one decision maker. By following the octave method, an organization can make information protection decisions based on risk to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical information technology assets. This flowchart shows the octave overview. There are 3 phases: build asset-based threat profiles, identify infrastructure vulnerabilities, and develop secure strategies and plans. There are 3 variations of the octave method: the original, octave S, and octave Allegro. With the Microsoft risk management approach, note there's 4 phases: assessing risk, conducting decision support, implementing controls, and measuring program effectiveness. In the figure provided, you see the Microsoft risk management approach. The factor analysis of information risk, or FAIR framework, includes a taxonomy of information risk to the modeling construct for analyzing complex risk scenarios. Basic analysis, or basic FAIR analysis, has a 10-step process in 4 different phases. Stage 1 is identifying the scenario components. Stage 2 is evaluating loss event frequency. Stage 3 evaluates probable loss magnitude, and Stage 4 derives and articulates risk. Unlike other risk management frameworks, FAIR relies on the qualitative assessment of many risk components using scales with value ranges, for example, high or very high to very low. Here you see a framework for factor analysis of information risk, or FAIR. The International Standards Organization is still one of my favorites and also has a standard for risk management, the 27005. It has a 5-stage risk management methodology, from risk assessment, treatment, acceptance, communication, and then monitoring and review. NIST also has a risk management framework. It's discussed in special publication 800 TAC 39, Managing Information Security Risk, Organization, Mission, and Information System View. The RMF, or Risk Management Framework, establishes a foundation for managing risk and delineates the boundaries for risk-based decisions within the organizations. Note that the enterprise-wide risk management framework includes strategic goals, mission and business functions, processes, architectures, and the System Development Life Cycle Process, SDLC. The second component of risk management addresses how organizations assess risk within the context of the organization's risk frame. The purpose of the risk assessment identifies threats, vulnerabilities, internal and external, the harm it could occur, and the likelihood that that harm will occur. The end result of all this is determination of risk. This should all sound very similar to other risk management models we've previously talked about. The support of the risk assessment component identify the tools needed, the assumptions related to the assessment, the constraints that may affect the assessment, roles and responsibilities, very important, and how risk assessment information is collected, conducted, the frequency that it should be done, and how that information is obtained. Note in the third component, the purpose of the risk response is to provide a consistent organization-wide response to risk by developing alternative courses of action, evaluating them, determining the appropriate course of action to take, and implementing risk responses based on a selected course of action. The fourth component of risk management addresses how organizations monitor risk over time. By monitoring risk, we can verify that planned risk response measures are implemented. We can determine the ongoing effectiveness of risk response measures and identify risk-impacting changes to organization information systems. Here you can see the risk management framework in a visual display. Notice the frame is in the middle. Here is a figure of the ENISA risk management process. In summary, remember that an economic feasibility is also a cost-benefit analysis. Remember the calculation of single loss expectancy and annualized loss expectancy. Remember that risk appetite defines the quantity and nature of risk that an organization is willing to accept. And residual risk is the risk unaccounted for after you implement a control. Also remember that once a control strategy has been implemented, the effectiveness of control should be monitored and measured, always. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Now, please take all this information and go complete your discussion posts and complete the assignments and labs. Have a great day.